The only way to destroy anti-Semitism once and for all is to expose the old European intelligence networks that originally created it in its modern form in order to destabilize target countries. There is no other way. I'm going to show you how in less than an hour. Like this video, subscribe to this channel, comment and share, and check out my ebook on old intelligence networks in Enlightenment and Communism. In case you don't already know, I am a German. The man you see on these photos here is my father's uncle Theo Benesch, a high-ranking Nazi who was a member of the Reichstag parliament in Berlin. He spent part of his career at the infamous anti-Semitic publication Der Stürmer. This was peak anti-Semitism. You cannot ever top that. So, did he have any special knowledge about Jews? No. Was he maybe an intelligence expert who could unravel the secret networks and operations of the past centuries? No. Was he at least a historian specialized in the empires and how they developed and what happened during the Enlightenment era? No. His background was in engineering, like most of the men in the family. He knew nothing about these other things, really. Instead, he had just consumed the conspiracy literature of that time, which hadn't really changed in decades. In the later half of the 19th century, there were tons of these publications, and even before that, French socialists had established most of these ideas. They claimed small Jewish families were trying to take over the world, and claimed greedy capitalism and exploitation were in essence Jewish, completely alien to Christian white people. Well, this was shortly after the era of serfdom. For many hundreds of years, roughly 90% of people were classified as serfs. That's not exactly the same as a slave, but it's awfully close. The system of serfdom had existed for millennia in the ancient Mesopotamian empires, ancient Greece, Rome, and then Europe. An elite of aristocratic families was oppressing everyone else. Pure exploitation, pure greed. You had to work till you dropped dead. If you got injured or sick, that was that. If the lords called you up for military service, you had to go, or you had to send your sons. So it was absurd when French socialists claimed, shortly after the end of serfdom in France, that exploitation was inherently Jewish. The anti-Semitism was just a way to get around the censorship at the time. You couldn't attack the French government too directly, or they would cut off your head with a guillotine. So it was just convenient for these early communists to blame Jews for capitalism. They tried to make it sound like trade and modern banking were weird and unfixable, because they wanted a socialist system. Recent research from an Austrian professor demonstrates that the beginning of modern conspiracy media right after the French Revolution was a ploy by British intelligence. The goal was to destabilize France, to make people believe the French Revolution was driven by devil-worshipping anarchists. A bit later, the next wave of conspiracy literature was supposed to slow down France's economic development. British intel was using middlemen to trash Britain's own new banking system, to call it a Jewish conspiracy in order to prevent competing empires from copying it. The next target for destabilization was Germany and Austria. That's when the right-wing groups copied the older French socialist material. The material became the foundation of the Nazi Party, their view of how the world was, how good and evil works, and how history supposedly was. My father grew up as a kid with his uncle Theo Benesch, the high-ranking Nazi who had worked at Der Stürmer publication. Theo had simply read a few of these conspiracy books and then thought he understood the world. He was incapable of determining if this stuff was really true. In reality, it had begun as a British intelligence operation to deceive target populations. In the 1800s, the conditions for all people on German territories gradually improved. Some Jews were still more traditional, others were not. Some even married non-Jews. So German Jews or Jewish Germans increasingly looked like everyone else. It was simply the conspiracy mythology that made them a target. And Islam, for the longest time, didn't really care about Jews. Islam was busy with other large empires, the Persians and so on. Jews were just a small group of unbelievers to them. If Jews lived in a Muslim country, they were treated, according to Islamic law, as second-class citizens. For a long time, Jews chose Muslim countries over Christian ones because the Christians would treat them worse. The only reason Muslims have this obsession with Jews and Israel today is the conspiracy mythology. The core of this mythology has two components. One, the idea that very few Jewish individuals managed to use intelligence techniques to gain control over the British colonial empire and over the United States. And second, Jews have almost magical, superhuman powers of subversion in connection with intelligence operations. These inherent attributes supposedly made them able to destroy the Roman Empire, the French one, Russia, etc. The Nazis had exaggerated these ideas to a degree where they believed it insufficient to limit activities of Jews or relocate them or force them to leave the country. Only physical destruction would do. When the Nazis used punch card tabulating machines for the Holocaust by the Hollerith Corporation, which had links to IBM, they had to define in the machine itself what the criteria were to be a Jew. Does you count everyone practicing the religion? Nah. 2 Jewish parents? No, it was enough to have 1 Jewish grandfather. The Nazis believed they were doing counterintelligence that way, counter-subversion, yet they completely failed in the field of intelligence. Germany was saturated with German spies giving secrets to Russia, Britain, and the United States. You see, for centuries, Germany had not been a unified empire. It was patchwork, little mini-kingdoms, principalities, dukedoms. Some were allied, some were enemies. The Welfs, Wettins, and Regenerates started out small. They didn't have large territories or armies. And therefore, they increased the size of their families, emphasized coherence inside these families, and emphasized intelligence techniques and science. They expanded to Denmark and other places, and ultimately they took over the British Empire and turned Britain into the dominant force on Earth. That means they still retained vast intel networks on German soil throughout World War I and World War II. It's one of the best kept secrets in history how vast and professional these networks were. And it's not hard to imagine, if you run a mega empire, you need mega intelligence capabilities. And modern historians, even the ones who specialize in intelligence topics, mistakenly believe that before the 20th century, intelligence networks were small, not really advanced. But recent studies even show that in ancient Rome, intelligence was vast and dictated everything. You always needed to know what's going on inside Rome. Possible uprisings, enemy operations. You needed to know what your foreign enemies were planning and what their weaknesses were. And so, the fairy tale of the Jewish world conspiracy is based on the false idea that before the 20th century, intelligence was underdeveloped. The ruling aristocracies are painted as daft buffoons, not hardened professionals who had spies everywhere. People have no idea how large these aristocratic family clusters were. Welfs, Wettins, and Regenerates were a literal army. This was the base of their success. They learned from the mistakes of the Roman Empire. You needed enough coherent personnel. According to the conspiracy fairy tale, Jews were masters of intelligence and everyone else was daft in comparison. These Jews supposedly managed to pull off miracles using nothing but a baseline courier system, some bank loans, and some simple trickery. A small Jewish trader from the Frankfurt ghetto, Meyer Amschel Rothschild, started to work for the Landgraf Wilhelm von Hessen-Kassel after a 20-year vetting process. That man's grandfather happened to be King George II of Britain. Now get this, the Landgraf was recruiting Rothschild. He was running Rothschild. And recruiting people is the most important task of intelligence work. And then Napoleon happened. You have the Hollywood movie now in cinemas. Rothschild helped Wilhelm von Hessen-Kassel to hide assets and then move assets out of the country. According to a variety of terrible conspiracy books, Rothschild stole a lot of money from the Landgraf, and there is zero evidence for this. Conspiracy books quote an old Jewish encyclopedia, but the source also contains no evidence. Rothschild performed clandestine tasks. He did what he was told, and later he worked directly for the British Crown, moving money for Wellington's troops. Britain wanted to hide money streams. That's why Rothschild's sons opened up offices in different countries. The whole operation was certainly run by British aristocratic intelligence. Next is the Waterloo fairy tale. And you know the story. Nathan Meyer Rothschild's early knowledge of the outcome of the Battle of Waterloo, whose couriers delivered information about the victory back to London before the British cabinet itself knew. He used his knowledge to speculate on the London Stock Exchange and make a vast fortune by unfair advantage against the other British stockholders, essentially defrauding them. None of this is true. None of this is true. The story was invented by a French communist, Georges-Marie Mathieu d'Anvelle, who authored a work entitled Edifying and Curious History of Rothschild I, King of the Jews. In reality, the Rothschilds did what the British Crown wanted them to do. Conspiracy books compounded the fairy tale nonsense by claiming that the Waterloo scam made the Rothschilds the masters of the banking district, City of London, and then masters of the central bank. You know, the stupid invented quotes how the Rothschilds didn't care who sat on the throne of England because they controlled the money. It's all nonsense. The high aristocracy wanted to remove itself from the limelight during the Enlightenment. That was the whole intention behind this controlled Enlightenment. King George I reconstituted the Royal Society for Science and started British Freemasonry. Those were sister organizations for the purpose of a controlled enlightenment. The vast aristocracy had the money, the science, and the intelligence networks to create front companies and political front organizations. They wanted everyone to believe that politicians and bankers and industrialists were making the decisions. That way, power became obfuscated. It seemed much more complex than it actually was. According to newer research like Cambridge historian Christopher Clark's book, Russia was the driving force behind World War I. They scaled up their military and had an alliance with France and Britain. Germany was in a much weaker alliance and had no real interest in war at that time. That was the age-old game in Europe: form a larger alliance and smash the weaker one. Obviously, Germany had also played that game for a long time. After the war, Germans were angry at the Brits. And guess what happened? A new campaign of antisemitism, spreading the fake protocols of Zion, claiming that Jews masterminded the war, that Jewish bankers had decided over war and peace for a long time. Well, for a long time, governments tried to find the money for wars. It was not a secret that different banks had different government customers. The governments always shifted their alliances and turned on each other. That was just the imperialism game. That was not a Jewish conspiracy. Britain had so many intel assets on German soil, it was easy to promote the anti-Jewish nonsense. So instead of Germans being angry at Britain, they were angry at Jews. You see, Britain was afraid Germany would rearm, make peace with the French, and overrun the British islands. And so a plan was hatched. Winston Churchill was involved and many others. Pulitzer Prize winner Luke Hilser has written about this plan, and Professor Carol Quigley. The plan was for Britain to pretend to have sympathies for Germany and fascism, to promote the anti-Jewish nonsense. If that plan worked, Germany would rather conduct an all-out attack on Soviet Russia than on Britain. Winston Churchill was positively reviewing the conspiracy books by Nestor Webster. The aristocrats visited the Nazis and pretended to like them. Aristocrats all over Germany joined the Nazi party, like Philipp von Hessen-Kassel. He joined the party in 1930, and he did diplomatic tasks for Hitler. Remember that name? Hessen-Kassel? The very same family which had once recruited Meyer Amschel Rothschild and was related to King George II and others. Philipp von Hessen was the son-in-law of the Italian king, and he was doing diplomatic tasks and had that connection to Benito Mussolini, who in his early days worked for British intelligence. That came out a few years ago. And for example, the London Guardian did a report on that. Prince George, Duke of Kent, had the job of managing covert communications between the aristocrats in Britain and Germany. Prince George was the son of King George V and Queen Mary. His brothers were the kings Edward VIII and George VI. During the early 20th century, the communist Soviet government spread the protocols of Zion in the Muslim world. Lenin had trashed Western capitalism as a conspiracy. The Soviets simply used Lenin's template, modified it for the Muslim target audience, and added the protocols of Zion. The goal was to make the Muslims hate the West and embrace Moscow. The only way to destroy anti-Semitism once and for all is to expose the old intelligence networks who created it. That is the only way. So why hasn't this been done? Because these old networks deem themselves more valuable than the Jews. Exposing the past would destroy these old networks. And the standard ways of combating anti-Semitism are too weak. All those left-wing social scientists blabbing about right-wing conspiracy theories. These people just debunk the easiest to debunk stuff and then advocate for socialism. They are not experts about the empires and intel agencies. Communists have been involved in this anti-Semitism game for a long time. So I told you how Lenin's philosophy was combined with the protocols of Zion to influence the Muslim world. So that's why they believe Israel is secretly running the world, and they are supposedly the cause of all the problems for the Muslim. This is where the obsession comes from. Now, originally Muslims ruled the Arabian territory, and then they expanded onto Persian territory, and then they took the Eastern Roman Empire territory, and then they spread further and further to Northern Africa, which originally was not Muslim. And then Muslims tried to invade Europe, and this was always the dream of taking over Europe. Not even the Turks were originally Muslim. They just converted because it seemed like a convenient thing to do at the time. So a tiny little state of Israel wouldn't have any significant meaning for the Muslims. They would not have seen this as any problem whatsoever. But because of this conspiracy literature, because of that, Muslims became obsessed with Jews. Islam was the second largest religion in the Soviet Union. At the time of the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, there were 25,000 mosques throughout the Russian Empire, which was reduced to just 500 by the 1970s in the Soviet Union. And in the years before the dissolution of the Soviet Union, between 45 and 50 million Soviet citizens identified themselves as Muslims. In 1917, Bolshevik revolutionary Vladimir Lenin published the text Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. And that text was basically a ripoff. He took this stuff from a German-Austrian guy. And Soviet secret services exerted influence beyond the borders of the USSR, such as the Palestinian groups, Egypt, Syria, etc. An anti-Western attitude among Muslims, with the corresponding framing according to Lenin, was billed as anti-imperialism. And this is why you see leftists nowadays support Hamas over Israel. Now, you probably followed the drama surrounding Greta Thunberg, the climate warrior, who has basically taken sides, even though she may still deny that. But this all goes back to Lenin. So, of course you should criticize Greta for being incompetent and, being a moron about this. But this problem extends to virtually all socialists. So this is a very common issue in socialism. And Lenin ripped off several people, actually. And for example, he took stuff from a text called Imperialism, a Study by John A. Hobson, an English economist. This was a text from 1902. Hobson's writings on the Second Buren War, particularly in the war in South Africa, its causes and effects, Hobson attributes the war in part to Jewish influence, including references to Rothschild bankers. And Hobson spoke of men of a single and distinct race. That's what he said. They have centuries of financial experience and are in a unique position to control the politics of nations. So this is where this comes from. British Labour Party leader Jeremy Corbyn wrote a foreword to the 2011 edition of Hobson's work, calling Hobson's analysis brilliant. In April 2020, an internal Labour Party report entitled "The Work of the Labour Party's Governance and Legal Unit in Relation to Antisemitism" was leaked to the media. It included 10,000 emails and thousands of private WhatsApp communications between former senior party officials. A major scandal arose about anti-Semitism. Corbyn supports the withdrawal of the United Kingdom from NATO and the dissolution of NATO. In April 2014, Corbyn wrote an article for the Morning Star in which he blamed the crisis in Ukraine on NATO. Corbyn is a member of the Palestine Solidarity Campaign. At a Stop the War coalition meeting in 2009, Corbyn said he had invited friends from Hamas and Hezbollah to an event in Parliament. Okay, so now you have communists saying pretty much the same things as some of the right-wingers in the West. They all frame this kind of the same way. They think Israel is bad, and they talk about the bankers and all that, and then they draw a parallel to what's happening in Ukraine. So it's sort of a conspiracy, and this conspiracy is responsible for the war. This is what's being insinuated. And so, according to that narrative, Russia is fighting that conspiracy. Okay, so this framing is making Russia more popular. For a left-wing audience, and a right-wing audience. Okay, so if you hear this stuff, if you listen to Tucker Carlson, if you listen to a bunch of other people, this is not a unique opinion. This is not a conservative opinion. It is, right now, it's a Russian opinion. It's a very manipulative opinion. Okay, and abandoning Ukraine is not going to help the world. And you see some of these recycled arguments. For example, there's corruption in Ukraine, therefore we shouldn't help them. Same argument was used many decades ago in relation to the civil war in China. This was the argument. That don't give any more weapons and ammo to the Chinese nationalists, because of corruption. So no more weapons, no more ammo. Guess what happened? The communists took power, let's not forget the American history. So not everyone supported the revolution or the independence of the United States. And there was also quite a bit of corruption. People wanted to fill their own coffers and not give money to the rebellion. Lots of corruption going on, but still, it was still kind of the correct goal to liberate America from Britain. Britain, which was run not just by King George III, but a vast family cluster of aristocratic families. The Welfs, Wettons, and Regenerits. It was imperative to separate from that. Despite corruption, despite problems, and also, who gave Washington the necessary money and the necessary weapons and the gunpowder and the equipment? Well, it was the French monarchy. So they supported this effort. The Americans couldn't have done this by themselves. And so this is how that works. Should the French have abandoned George Washington and the Americans because of some corruption over there? This is the stuff you need to be aware of. This is what this is all about. And so this anti-Semitism game can be played with literally every topic imaginable. It doesn't matter what the crisis is. It doesn't matter what happens next. It will always be painted as a Jewish Western conspiracy. So if there's another pandemic, well, it's that kind of conspiracy, people will say. If Russia attacks another country, they will say it's a Jewish conspiracy, and the Russians are just defending against that. If Russia openly aligns with China and North Korea to have multiple attacks, then they will say it's to fight this grand Jewish conspiracy, or they will insinuate that they're fighting a Jewish conspiracy. It's if there's a terrorist attack in the United States or a series of terror attacks in the United States, people will say this is all just false flags by the Jewish conspiracy, and you have to be hopping mad now and cause a bunch of trouble. And every time this sort of narrative, this sort of stuff benefits the Russians, or to some degree it also benefits others. To see America weak, especially the population of America. So you really need to learn about these old intelligence networks, and you also should check out other material on real intelligence networks and operations. There's so many good books out there. You won't have time to read them all, even when you are a full-time researcher. So you have to pick and choose and find the best stuff, But if you only read every now and then, you could still pick out some really, really excellent stuff, or you listen to this program. So we read these books for you and tell you what's most important in them. It's so imperative, and there's no replacement for this whatsoever. Baseline, regular old conspiracy activism is not the same as an intelligence mindset and intelligence analysis. So you can check out more videos on this channel. There was a 2-part discussion of, by me and Jeff Nyquist. It's called Fake Experts Part 1 and 2. So we go in depth on, the last 200 years worth of conspiracy media and how manipulative it really is and what damage it caused. And you can also find my ebook, link is in the description below. It's The Royal Cryptocracy, Old Intelligence Networks in Enlightenment and Communism. So this is the secret sauce, basically, for communism. People have wondered for a long time, why was communist intelligence so successful? How did they penetrate the West so thoroughly? All these moles, all their successes over here, which were our losses. What is the secret? What is the secret sauce? Well, the secret sauce seems to be connections to these old intelligence networks. So, like this video, comment, spread it on social media, and subscribe to this channel.